My name is Marcus Langston. I'm 34 years old. I was raised in a modest home by a single mother who worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. I've worked for everything I have. No shortcuts, no handouts. I built a decent career in IT, finally moved into a better part of the city, and had just gotten engaged to the woman I thought was my partner for life. Her name was Claire. Elegant, ambitious, and from old money. I thought I had finally stepped into the next chapter of my life. The day I was supposed to meet Claire's parents, I was already running behind. It was a formal dinner at their estate. Her words, not mine, and she stressed how important this first impression would be. Just smile and let me do the talking, she had said with a laugh. I took it in stride, suited up, and left my apartment determined to impress. The roads were slick with rain, and traffic was slow, which only made my nerves worse. About halfway through the drive, I saw an elderly man standing at a busy intersection, clearly confused. He looked lost, soaked, and shaken. Something in me refused to keep driving. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and asked if he needed help. He hesitated, then told me he was trying to get home but couldn't remember the exact address. His clothes were damp, his shoes nearly falling apart. Without a second thought, I offered him a ride, thinking I could still make it in time. As we drove, he started remembering details, landmarks, street names. I reassured him we'd find it. The GPS didn't help, so we followed his memory. It took longer than expected, but eventually we pulled into a quiet, gated driveway. He turned to me and smiled, eyes filled with gratitude. "They'll be so glad to see me," he said softly. I helped him to the front door and rang the bell, unaware of what I was about to walk into. The door opened. A woman stood there, tall, perfectly dressed, with sharp eyes that narrowed the second she saw me. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen her before, in framed photos at Claire's apartment. It was her mother, but what truly froze me wasn't her presence. It was the way her expression twisted when she saw the old man next to me. Shock, disgust, and something deeper, fear. The old man looked up at her and whispered her name, Vivienne, but she didn't answer. She turned to me and said, coldly, "Where did you find him?" And in that moment, standing on the threshold of the life I was about to marry into, I realized I had just brought home a secret that Claire and her entire family had buried, and now I was holding the shovel that could dig it up. I stood frozen on that marble doorstep, the wind pressing against my back. A silence swallowed the moment. Vivienne's face, Claire's mother, was pale, rigid, her lips parted but her eyes darting with calculation. The man beside me, still holding onto my arm, looked both relieved and confused. He seemed to expect a warm welcome. Instead, he got icy distance. "Inside," she finally said, stepping aside. I hesitated for half a second, but followed. I couldn't leave him standing in the cold. Not after all this. The foyer was massive. Chandeliers, ivory columns, oil paintings. It felt more like a museum than a home. I helped the old man onto a nearby bench while Vivienne stepped away and called out to someone. I assumed staff, but I noticed something else. Panic. She wasn't composed. She wasn't in control. And something about this man had cracked her facade. Claire came rushing in from the hallway moments later, her eyes widening when she saw me and then narrowing when she saw him. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She whispered to her mother with hurried breath, glancing at me between sentences. I couldn't hear what they were saying. But I didn't need to. I'd seen this look before, when people scrambled to cover something, not confront it. That's when the old man looked at me with a soft smile and said, "She was 5 the last time I saw her, my daughter." I felt the words like a slow punch to the chest. Claire's father. That's who he was. Not some distant cousin. Not a confused man off the street, her father. The man whose photos were nowhere in their home. The man Claire had only ever mentioned once, in passing, saying he had left when she was young. But he hadn't just left, he had been erased. And I had unknowingly delivered him to the front door of the people who had written him out of existence. The air thickened. Claire finally turned to me and said, "Marcus, please wait in the other room." Her voice was quiet, but it held authority, the kind that didn't ask but told. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't part of this family. I wasn't being welcomed in. I was being managed, controlled, silenced. I didn't move. I just watched her and her mother try to shepherd the old man away like a problem, not a person. My silence unsettled them. I could see it. I stood tall, nodded, and simply said, "I'll wait." But I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was waiting for the truth. I didn't come to this house looking for betrayal, but now that I had found it, I wasn't going to let it slip through my hands. And as I sat in the shadow of wealth, I started to ask myself the question that would change everything. What else have they lied about? They led him away quietly, almost like they were trying to hide him, even inside their own home. I sat in that cold, polished sitting room, the kind that looks untouched, decorative pillows, perfectly fluffed, fresh flowers placed but never admired. I didn't touch anything, I just listened. Soft voices echoed from down the hallway. No warmth, no reunion. Just muffled arguments behind closed doors. I started to put the pieces together, not with anger, but with clarity. Claire returned after nearly 20 minutes. Her face was composed, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with her bracelet, fingers restless. She smiled like nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just met the man who should have walked her down the aisle. "Marcus, I'm sorry about all that," she began. "My father, he's not well. He's confused. He shows up like this sometimes." Her tone was smooth, rehearsed. She thought I'd believe it. Maybe once I would have. But something about her eyes told me everything I needed to know. They weren't worried. They were calculating. She wasn't protecting him. She was protecting a story, a version of her past that made her life neater, more acceptable. She reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. Instead, I asked, "Did you know he was still alive?" Her mouth opened, paused, and then closed again. That hesitation told me the truth she wouldn't say. She tried to recover, offered excuses, mental health, complications, family pain. But all I heard was betrayal, not just of a father, but of me. Because if she could hide this, what else had she chosen to curate? What parts of her life were real and which were performance? That night I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I listened, nodded, and smiled like I understood. But inside, I had already stepped out of the relationship, quietly, carefully. Over the next few days, I began to dig. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I reached out to an old friend who worked in probate law and casually asked about any cases involving the Langstons. I combed through public records, pieced together whispers Claire had once let slip. It turned out her father hadn't just been erased from the family, he'd been legally stripped of access to everything: assets, property, legacy, and the paperwork had her signature. I didn't react, I took notes. I observed. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Claire and her mother had deliberately rewritten history to preserve their version of legacy, and now I had become part of their carefully constructed narrative, until I showed up with the one man they couldn't control. I didn't need to confront them. I just needed to make a decision, and when the time came, I would make sure the truth wasn't buried again. I didn't return to Claire's estate after that night, and I didn't answer her calls for 2 days. On the third day, I sent a short message, I think we need some space, she replied instantly, begging to meet, saying she could explain, that it was complicated. I didn't respond. I wasn't punishing her. I was observing, watching how quickly her composure would crack when silence replaced obedience. And sure enough, it did. What she didn't know was that I had already contacted her father again. I tracked down the nursing home where he had been living, not far from the edge of town, in a modest facility that clearly hadn't seen much family visitation. When I walked in, he recognized me immediately. "You're the man who brought me home," he said, his voice calm but a little strained. I sat with him for hours that day, and the story he told me was nothing like the one Claire tried to sell. He had never left them, not willingly. After a stroke weakened him and left him vulnerable, Vivienne filed for guardianship and quietly pushed him out of the family's affairs. She told friends he had gone senile, and Claire, only a teenager at the time, accepted the story, or maybe chose to. It didn't matter. The damage had been done. They took everything and left him in silence, hidden in a place where no one would ask questions. I realized something then. This wasn't just a betrayal of a man, it was a betrayal of humanity. They had turned legacy into performance, and family into theater. But I also saw something else in him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't seeking revenge. He just wanted to see his daughter again. That desire, it humbled me. Made me feel something I hadn't expected: purpose. This wasn't just about walking away from Claire, it was about making sure truth had its own moment in the light. So I crafted a plan, not dramatic, not loud, just honest. I invited Claire to dinner at a quiet restaurant. She showed up dressed as if stepping into a magazine spread, poised, perfect. She tried to make small talk. I let her. And then I slid a small envelope across the table. Inside, copies of her father's story, his medical records, the guardianship forms, and his written statement. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She looked up at me, eyes searching for something, maybe an opening to lie, maybe an excuse to cry. But I said nothing. I let silence be my voice. That's when the weight began to press down on her. Not because I yelled, not because I exposed her, but because I held up a mirror and forced her to see who she had become. And for the first time since all this began, she couldn't look away. Claire didn't say much after that. Her posture stiffened, her eyes darted toward the window, and her fingers folded the edge of the envelope with nervous precision. She tried to form words, but nothing came out. I didn't interrupt her silence. I let the truth linger between us like thick fog. Eventually she whispered, "You don't understand what it was like." But I did. I understood exactly what it was like to feel powerless, to be manipulated, and then to find the strength to walk away. I paid for the meal, left the envelope on the table, and walked out. That was the last time I saw her. There was no confrontation, no last argument. I didn't need it. I had already taken back control, not just of the situation, but of my dignity, and what she didn't realize in that moment was that her world had already started to shift, quietly, slowly, like a tide changing direction before anyone feels it beneath their feet. Weeks later, her father's story began to surface, not publicly, but in the right places. I helped him file a petition to revisit the terms of his guardianship. I found a journalist friend, someone who specialized in investigative human stories, and shared his background, not as a scandal, but as a quiet reckoning. The kind of story that whispers truth instead of screaming accusation. And in a city where reputations are currency, whispers travel fast. Vivienne began receiving inquiries, polite at first, then persistent. Old acquaintances started to ask questions, and suddenly Claire's perfectly curated life began to feel less stable. Wedding plans were put on hold. Sponsors withdrew support from the charity gala she was hosting. And though no headlines ever named her directly, Everyone knew her story no longer belonged to her. It had cracked open, and truth was spilling out. Through it all, I stayed silent. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't chasing vindication. I just kept showing up for her father, bringing him books, helping him move into a better facility once the court ordered a review. He smiled more now. Sometimes he would ask about Claire, and I'd tell him gently, give it time, not because I believed she deserved it, but because he did. He deserved a chance to hope. That was my justice, not destruction, but restoration. I didn't tear Claire down. I simply stepped out of the fantasy she created and placed truth in her path. And when the fantasy crumbled, I was already gone, free, not bitter, not broken, just whole. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully, knowing I had done the one thing they never expected me to do, see everything, and still choose silence over spectacle. I never needed revenge to be loud. In fact, the quieter it unfolded, the more power it carried. What mattered to me was that I reclaimed something deeper than pride. I reclaimed my sense of truth. And sometimes that's more devastating than any public fallout. I didn't check up on Claire after that. I didn't need to. The damage wasn't mine to manage. I had simply placed a mirror in front of her and walked away before she had a chance to shatter it. Her father, whom I began to call Mr. Langston out of respect, became a quiet fixture in my life. We had coffee on Sunday mornings. He taught me chess. I read him passages from books he loved in college. Books he said reminded him of who he used to be. Slowly, he began to speak with more clarity, more strength. The man they had hidden for years was returning, not out of revenge, but out of renewal. And I was proud to witness that. I learned something through him. Redemption is not always about the one who caused the harm. Sometimes it's about those who survive it, who find their way back to wholeness, even after being forgotten. He never asked for pity, never once blamed Claire or Vivienne aloud. He simply kept living one quiet day at a time. And I realized I wanted that kind of strength for myself. Not reactive, not theatrical, just still and solid and unshakable. Months passed, and one day a letter arrived at my door. No return address. Just my name written in delicate handwriting I hadn't seen since the dinner at that estate. Inside, a short note from Claire. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know you were right. That was it. No promises, no explanations, just acknowledgement. And for some reason it meant more than any apology ever could. I didn't write back. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. The story had ended. And some stories are better left without epilogues. I kept the letter tucked in a drawer, not as a memory of her, but as a reminder to myself. I didn't need to fight to win. I only needed to walk away with my integrity intact. Looking back, that day I stopped to help a stranger was never an accident. It was divine timing, an interruption that revealed everything I wasn't meant to build a life on. And while it led me through pain, it also led me back to myself. That's the funny thing about betrayal. It doesn't just reveal who they are, it reveals who you are when the curtain falls. As spring rolled in, Mr. Langston's case finally moved forward. The court reviewed the documents, the medical reports, and the conditions of his care, and in a closed-door hearing, they restored his legal autonomy. No grand announcements, no flashing cameras, just a quiet correction of an injustice that had gone on too long. When I told him the news, he looked down at his hands, then simply said, "I never thought I'd matter again." That broke something in me, and healed something too. We celebrated with coffee and apple pie from a diner he used to frequent in his younger days. As we sat in that booth, surrounded by clinking cutlery and the smell of old vinyl, he shared stories about Claire as a child. Stories filled with laughter, not bitterness. I could see how deeply he still loved her, even after all the silence, and I realized that real strength isn't found in cutting people off. It's found in loving people without needing to be right. At one point he looked at me and said, "You changed more than just my life, Marcus. You changed the way I see the world." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't trying to be anyone's savior. I was just a man who refused to ignore what was right in front of him. And maybe sometimes that's enough, to simply not look away when others do. Life moved on. I went back to work, took on new projects, reconnected with old friends. But I was different now. Not colder, just more aware. I trusted less easily, but loved more deeply. I laughed louder, but stayed quieter in rooms where truth wasn't welcome. And I never again questioned the value of staying grounded in who I am, even when others tried to pull me into illusions. One night, while walking through the park, I saw a young couple sitting on a bench, laughing, holding hands, eyes bright with the kind of love I once thought I had. For a moment, a flicker of sadness passed through me. But it didn't stay, because I knew now that love without truth is just decoration. And I would rather wait alone for the real thing than live surrounded by lies in silk. That was my closure. Not revenge, not exposure, but a peace so full, so real, that it didn't need to be seen to be complete. A quiet heart, a steady step, a truth that needed no permission to exist. That to me was the final victory. Mr. Langston's story eventually made its way into a local human interest column, a soft spotlight, delicately told, framed around resilience and family redemption. Names were omitted, details blurred. But anyone from that world who read it would recognize the silhouettes. I didn't write the piece. I didn't even ask for it to be written. But the journalist I spoke to months earlier called me and said, "Some stories need air, Marcus. Even if they whisper." I agreed. Whispered truth is still truth. Claire's circle began to shift. Subtly at first, invitations stopped arriving. Her name was no longer in rotation at the events her family used to dominate. No scandals, no accusations, just distance. The social world she thrived in turned quiet around her, not because anyone wanted revenge, but because authenticity is magnetic and her mask had slipped. Eventually, people start choosing light, even if it exposes what they didn't want to see. I never gloated, never posted about it. I didn't even tell anyone beyond a few close friends, because what I carried wasn't about her downfall. It was about my survival. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I had been willing to hand over, just to be accepted. That realization has shaped every decision I've made since. I no longer shrink to fit in places that require me to leave pieces of myself behind. A few months later, I moved. Not far, just to a smaller place near the coast. Something quieter, slower, more human. I started volunteering at a local center for the elderly, helping folks learn basic tech so they could video call their grandkids. Mr. Langston came with me a few times, teaching chess to anyone who'd listen. We became something like family, not bound by blood, but by choice, by truth, by mutual restoration. Every once in a while I still think about Claire, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. She showed me what deception dressed in elegance looks like, and that lesson, though painful, became priceless. I don't know if she ever healed from it. I hope she did, but that's not my story to follow anymore. Mine ended the day I chose dignity over illusion. And now, when people ask me why I look so peaceful, I tell them it's because I don't carry what doesn't belong to me anymore. I lay it down. I walk away. And I build a life rooted in what's real, even if it's quieter, even if it takes longer. Because nothing is more powerful than a man who knows his worth and refuses to trade it for anyone's approval. There's a stillness that comes after the storm, Not just in the world around you, but inside. It's the kind of calm you can't fake, the kind that only shows up once you've stood face to face with disappointment and refused to let it rewrite you. That stillness began to define my days. I no longer woke up anxious about being enough. I stopped trying to prove myself to people who only valued my silence, not my soul. One afternoon, I returned to that intersection, the same place where I had first stopped to help Mr. Langston. The light was red again, the sidewalk busy, cars rushing past like nothing had changed. But that brief pause on a rainy afternoon had redirected the entire trajectory of my life. It reminded me that sometimes the smallest detour is actually divine intervention dressed in inconvenience. And I've learned to pay attention when life slows me down. The world had become quieter, yes, but it had also become clearer. I no longer tolerated half-truths or masked intentions. That didn't mean I became cold or cynical. It meant I learned how to really listen to what isn't being said, and that skill has protected me more times than I can count. Because when someone's truth is hidden behind charm, it's your stillness that reveals it, not your suspicion. I reconnected with my mother during that season too, told her everything. She cried when I told her how Claire's family had treated her father. She held my hand and said, "I'm proud of the man you became, because you didn't lose your heart just to win." That moment healed a part of me that I hadn't even known was still bruised. It reminded me that the people who truly love you will never ask you to become less so they can feel like more. As months passed, the pain faded, but the lessons stayed. I stopped rushing, stopped chasing. I started building a life that felt like mine, slow, steady, rooted. I took up writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Just reflections, observation, thoughts I had kept buried under the noise of ambition. And to my surprise, people started reading them, reaching out, saying they felt seen. It turns out, truth resonates, even in its softest form. And in all of that growth, I finally understood the full gift of what I had been through. I didn't just lose a relationship, I lost the version of myself that thought love meant staying quiet. And in that loss, I gained something far more powerful, clarity. And once you have that, no one, not even someone you once loved, can take it from you again. It's strange how healing doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like solitude, like sitting alone in a cafe and realizing you're not waiting on anyone anymore, not for closure, not for permission, not even for company. I remember one evening, watching the sun dip behind the horizon as seagulls circled above, and I thought to myself, I am finally enough for me. No performances, no masks, just presence. Claire never reached out again after that letter, and that was the most respectful thing she ever did. Some people come into your life to reveal the places where you're still bleeding, and once the wound is exposed, they're gone. It used to feel cruel. Now it feels necessary, because without her, I might have still been chasing illusions, still fitting myself into a story that was never written with me in mind. Mr. Langston eventually moved into an apartment of his own, a small place by the harbor, where he could watch the boats and feed the pigeons. We still spoke often, but I could tell he needed to write the rest of his life on his terms now. He had reclaimed his name, his narrative, and the right to exist without shame. Watching him live again reminded me that restoration is always possible, even after years of silence. I had long since given back the engagement ring, left it in an envelope with no note. I heard later she sold it, donated the proceeds to a charity for dementia patients. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was growth. I'll never know. But I smiled when I heard it. Even if redemption wasn't possible between us, at least a piece of that ending was used for something good. It meant that the truth in some way had changed her too. I eventually started dating again, but this time from a place of honesty, not fantasy, no more falling for Polish. I sought presence, kindness, emotional depth, and I showed up the same way, unpolished but real. One woman in particular began to feel different. Her name was Elena. We met at the community center. She had eyes that didn't search for status, only sincerity. We moved slow. We talked deeply, and there was no pretending. That's how I knew it was real. And so the story, the one that began on a rainy road and cracked open a carefully hidden past, ended not with revenge but with renewal. I was never the man they expected to dismantle them, but I was the man who refused to disappear. I didn't fight to destroy what they built. I simply refused to hold up the walls of their illusion. And when I let go, they fell under their own weight. That was more than enough. There's something sacred about building your life from truth. Not the kind of truth that demands to be shouted, but the kind that hums underneath your skin, quietly guiding every step. That's the life I live now. Measured, intentional, peaceful. And it's not because I was lucky. It's because I was willing to let go of anything that required me to abandon myself to keep it. Sometimes people ask me if I ever miss her, if I ever think about what could have been. And the answer is yes. But not the way they expect. I miss the version of myself that once believed love was about proving your worth. That part of me was so eager to be chosen that he didn't realize he was already valuable, and losing her helped me find him again. Mr. Langston passed away peacefully 1 year later. I was with him when he took his final breath. No pain, no fear, just the gentle sigh of a man who had finally been seen again. In his will, he left me a letter, just a single page. It read, "Thank you for treating me like a man, not a mistake. Because of you, I died whole." I held that letter for a long time, and I wept, not from grief, but from gratitude. Elena and I got married 2 years after that. It was a small ceremony by the ocean, just a handful of people and the sound of waves hitting the shore. No performances, no pageantry, just presence. Real love doesn't need an audience. It only needs two people willing to be fully seen and still stay. She knows everything about my past, and she still looks at me like I'm home. Now, every time I pass by that intersection where it all began, I slow down, not because I expect to see anyone, but because it reminds me the most important moments of your life won't announce themselves. They'll arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience, wrapped in discomfort, and if you're paying attention, they'll change everything. So, if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a moment that feels like betrayal, pause, breathe. And remember this: what breaks you isn't always there to destroy you. Sometimes it's there to reveal who you were, always meant to become. And when you choose to rise without revenge, you don't just win, you transcend. That's what I did, and I wouldn't trade that peace for anything in the world.